All right, so last time we were taking a look at episode 18. It was exactly what I expected to really see. Um, and after a lot of comments, I did some more investigating on the lightsaber styles, and so it's been years since I actually looked at them. But yeah, there is a counter to the librarian. And there's always a counter to something, and it works out very well that way. One of the things I've appreciated about the way he's conducted this is the things that he's made stronger in certain universes complement the things that are made stronger than others. So I can appreciate the way he's handling this. In any case, we have episode 19 now, Silent Night. We're going to go ahead and get into this, and hopefully the pugs won't be going crazy. If they start going crazy, I'm really sorry, guys. There's really not that much I can do about it. I'm here by myself, and normally she keeps them relatively well behaved when I'm in the process of recording, but the hospitaler's not here. So it is what it is, guys. Here we go. I'm going to fast forward this to the start. There we go. I like that.
Anakin strode forward, projecting a confidence and casual air into his steps which could scarcely be more at odds with how he actually felt. To the left, right, above, and even below, again and again he could feel the dragging, clawing sensation of naked attention being paid to him and the men around him, tugging subtly against the skein of his tightly wound telepathic senses. He knew he should have taken comfort from the fact that each and every time, if he focused, he could sense the attention either slide away without suspicion or linger with suspicion of the wrong kind. The Jedi Knight, his faithful droid, and the elite soldiers of Clone Force 99 continued their advance, attempting to act as nonchalant as possible as the group followed after the entranced servitor. Anakin had contrived to use a Jedi mind trick against the man-machine, and had found it so utterly susceptible to his suggestions that, after confirming the length of its new false loyalty, the Jedi had ordered it to take them to where they needed to go, the ship's central computer systems. And indeed, it had moved without hesitation as if to comply. However, it had also chosen to take the most expedient route to their destination. And, as it turned out, the quickest way to their target was through the bustling, cramped streets of the ship's bowels. Unable to make it understand circumvention, and equally unable to follow its movements through the crowds while hiding, Hunter had hesitantly proposed a risky solution. "Well, sir, we could just follow it. We get rid of any open Republic markings on our armor, take our helmets off, and act natural, and we might not draw any undue attention," the commando had said. Anakin had scoffed at this. "Right. As much as I'd like to take the direct route here, Hunter, I don't think that we'll get away with just openly walking down the street as a Jedi, 4 clones, and an astromech droid. Trust me,
That
the
might draw
rogues
some
in armor,
attention.
they tend to draw attention," he had said. "With all due respect, sir, that might not be the case here. I've been paying close attention to the locals, and frankly, we may not look as odd in that crowd as you might think. Our armors are not standard, and we've had so many modifications done on our gear that it's far from uniform, or white. On top of that, while we are technically clones, we're also oddballs, mutants, and freaks. Normally works against us back on Kamino, but here, I doubt anyone could guess at a glance that we're even related, much less clones," the clone commando had said, walking over to a nearby wall as he spoke and drawing his high-powered vibro knife. He began to carve into the stone used for the wall here, carefully gouging out one of the gilded, two-headed eagles that they had seen emblazoned on nearly everything. And as for you, sir, it's more or less the same. If we scuff up your robes a bit and pin some of this imperial junk onto where people can see it... He had paused then and grunted as he pulled the eagle free, turned around, and held the rough stone and gold icon out towards Anakin. The Jedi had taken it and grimaced. He rather liked the style and quality of his robes, but the more he had thought about it, the more it had made sense. A hesitant beeping had brought his attention down to R2. "What about him?" Anakin asked, gesturing towards the sentient machine.
I'm sorry about the sounds of the pugs. They are being annoying.
The Imperials aren't exactly fans of droids, Anakin had reminded him. No, they aren't, Tech had said as he stepped in beside Hunter. But they do not mind certain kinds of drones, and of course the droidmen like this one. So all we need to do is make him look close enough to one of those, he had suggested. And how do we do that? Anakin had asked. Tech had shrugged then and looked around. It honestly shouldn't be too hard, he had said, eyes fanning the area for a few moments. He had asked permission then for a few minutes to search the immediate area, and had soon returned with a few broken skulls he'd retrieved from the refuse containers nearby. 2 were not real skulls, but rather extremely convincing plaster replications, ornaments of some kind which had been broken and discarded. It had taken Tech only a matter of moments to weld these and a few other choice pieces of discarded junk to R2's cylindrical frame. The Jedi had been hardly convinced by the display, but after a few moments more, conceded to at least testing the idea. Not long after, all of them, droid included, had found themselves cutting almost down the exact center of the broadest of the ship's internal avenues, slowly striding behind the clinking, clanking form of their mindless guide. Anakin had forced himself several times to breathe calm back into his senses as he walked, but found it increasingly difficult. The droidman's ungainly gait was just fast enough to be ahead of a walk, but barely slower than a jog, and all the Jedi Knight wanted at this moment was to be away and out of sight as soon as the Force would permit. Luckily, Hunter had been right, with none of them drawing the kinds of stares or suspicions that screamed, "Oh look! There's the enemy and one of their generals, walking casually through our ship! Quick! Somebody psychopath them to death before they can escape!" The members of the Bad Batch in particular seemed to blend right in, their black, specialized armor evidently different enough from the armaments of the other clones to break any implicit association. They cradled their helmets in the crooks of their arms and hid or obscured their weaponry with tatters of cloth. Imperial double-headed eagles welded to the fronts of their breastplates. The printed skulls naturally ornamenting their battle gear didn't hurt either. Anakin had hidden his lightsaber and raised his hood to shroud himself. Though it had required some more rummaging, R2 had managed to scrounge up a few skull icons, using his specialized tools to integrate them into Anakin's robes, giving the Jedi's clothes some scuffing and burns for good measure.
Nice.
He was hardly pleased by the necessity, but was grateful it seemed to be working. Though some of the shambling inhabitants paused to stare, none seemed too alarmed nor too distressed by their passing, and Anakin could sense no overt suspicion, though he did feel drafts of awe and wonder from a few.
Yeah.
Clearly they were mistaking him and his retinue for some other authority,
Priest.
and whatever that authority was, Imperials did not question it. As far as Anakin was concerned, that suited him just fine, as long as it stayed that way. Though, in his experience, anyone or any group high-profile enough to cause crowds to split without staring over long was likely one which could expect to receive the opposite kind of treatment from anyone near their rank. As if to confirm his dread, a small group stepped out into their path, eyes watching him, clearly intent on intercepting him and the clones. Boss, what do we do?" asked Wrecker from the side of his mouth. "Shh! Let me do the talking," said Anakin, walking ahead of the others slightly and waving his hand behind the servitor. "Stop when you reach the woman in the armor," the Jedi whispered to it. The servitor gave no sign that it had heard him, but it did as it was instructed, halting before the three who stood in their path. All three were women, two with their faces hidden behind brass masks, shaped like the picturesque face of a maiden weeping blood, while the one in the center wore a half-dome helmet which covered most of her face, leaving only her mouth exposed, eyes hidden behind a glowing red visor. "Yes, is there a reason you're in our way?" Anakin asked, using his most imperious and authoritative voice. The woman merely stared at him for a time, and then at the others. All three of the women held shotguns, large and square in their armored fists. Though the weapons were not aimed and leveled, he had no doubt they could be in mere moments or less. A cold sweat began to gather under his robes, but he kept himself stock still, watching the women from under the shadow of his cowl. "You are not the Inquisitor," the woman said. Anakin felt a shock of panic run through him, but he smothered it as he smoothly responded without missing a beat. "No, I'm not. I don't recall claiming to be. Were you expecting him?" he asked. She paused a moment and nodded. "He is overdue for the interrogation."
Oof.
"Who are you, if not he? Where are you going?" Already, Anakin could sense the clones tensing behind him, hands preparing to heft weapons, aggression rising. He could sense the same coming from the three in front of him as well, yet they did not raise their weapons or outright demand his identity. The clones were holding back to keep their cover. Why were these three holding back? They were still afraid of who he might be, he realized. They had no desire to inflict injury onto themselves by mouthing off to the wrong person, and so they held themselves in check, for now. But as surely as Anakin could sense this, he could also sense that he was one wrong answer away from becoming much more intimately acquainted with the business ends of their shotguns. "I'm his interrogator, of course," said Anakin, giving a slight flourish. The woman seemed surprised at first, but before she could further question it, he added, "The Inquisitor is otherwise indisposed. He said I should be enough to handle it. Do you doubt his judgment?"
Good.
Anakin asked. He had no idea what an Inquisitor was, or where specifically they fell into the command structure, but from her reaction, he surmised it was a considerably powerful position. No, not at all. Come then, we have no time to waste. The Silent Enforcer won't be denied her justice for another day. So if you and your master want to squeeze answers out of the seditionist scum, then you are going to have to do it soon," said the woman, stepping back and turning around to lead him away. Anakin scowled. She was not exactly walking in the same direction as the servitor had been leading them. He looked back and saw the clones all staring, waiting to take his lead. "Keep going to the central computers," he whispered to the servitor, waving his hand to send it on its way. "Go on without me, gentlemen. I'll meet with you later. No need to wait up," he said more loudly, turning to follow the three women. The clones stared after him for a moment. "Scrog, what do we do now?" asked Crosshair, spitting to the side as he turned to watch the trundling servitor as it made its way away from them. "We follow orders," said Hunter, waving for them to start moving, following after the droidman. "Do you think the general will be all right?" Tech asked.
I can picture about 1,000 ways this could go very, very badly.
As they moved to obey. "I hope so," said Hunter with a shake of his head. "Well, he needed us pretty bad last time," Wrecker said, speaking just a little too loudly, and earning an elbow to the gut from Crosshair. The big man laughed and rubbed his ribs, but no one else had anything to add to his statement except for R2. The droid released a low, worried whistle, stopping and turning in Anakin's direction, watching the Tatooine slave turned Jedi Knight disappearing into the filthy crowds of the ship.
Later.
Anakin followed the three women in silence. He stayed behind them and swayed slightly as he walked, keeping himself just out of the corner of their eyes as they made their way to where the interrogation was meant to be held. More than anything, he was afraid that his disguise would not hold up under prolonged scrutiny, and so worked to keep himself from being casually observed. They had been walking for a long while when they reached a set of vaulted doors, which led into an absolutely massive turbolift. A droid man was fused into the wall near the controls, and after hearing an elaborate passcode, the mindless man began to tap and type away, shutting the huge doors and starting the lift as it descended down. Anakin looked to the left and to the right. The space was large enough to carry 10 LAT gunships end to end across, and 7 from front to back, but the 4 of them were the only ones present within. "Is it much farther?" asked Anakin. "No, 5 minutes out after we reach the block. He is already being held in the interrogation room, though we still need the enforcer to open the door," the head of the three said. "And is she there already?" he probed further. "No, but she will meet us there. She had actually left to find the Inquisitor. She'd still be searching for him if we hadn't found you," she said. The lift came to a shuddering halt, and the doors opened. A profound sense of suffering and suffocating darkness flooded in with them, like a tide of foul air being released all at once. Anakin almost staggered, and even the 3 women before him seemed to stiffen, as if sensing some inkling of what had assailed him. He gathered his wits as quickly as he could manage, and followed the 3 as they led him out. The whole ship had been a dreary combination of Gothic stone and steel. The lighting on the ship flickered, was dim, or was not present at all, and when the light was consistent, it was shaded yellow or red, casting sickly or violent luminescence across the already grim architecture of the vessel. But here, things were different. The lights were white and persistent, and though the walls and floors seemed no less gothic in nature, they still managed to exude an aura of insidious menace that far outstripped that which pervaded the rest of the ship. Perhaps it was the thick layers of purity seals which hung in clusters along the walls, or the faded scratch marks left along the...
Imagine you accidentally say that you're in the retinue of one of the most feared things in a universe, from a universe that is just packed to the brim with scary shit. And oh god, this is bad.
Black stone floors. Or maybe it was all the screaming and shouting that Anakin could barely not hear, like a chorus of wailing moans and pleas pulled from his own thoughts and not his true senses. Whatever it was, a considerable wrongness haunted this place, and Anakin found himself working against his own reluctance as the 3 began to exit the lift, expecting him to follow. Swallowing hard, Anakin took a deep breath and held it, counting out to 4 and releasing it before moving forward. This new place was incredibly stuffy and humid, yet to the Jedi, it felt freezing. The Force was bleached here, altered, maybe even damaged. The threads and fibers which tied and bound it to everything were notably abused, as if stretched and snapped, and then resewn, again and again. Just the passing sense of it was making his head throb painfully, and he was forced to constrain a few groans of suppressed agony as the sensations continued to worsen. Nothing I can't handle. I've been to weird places before.
Yeah.
This is nothing I can't handle. Anakin found himself thinking. The very act was an alarming sign of its own. So many parts of him were screaming. He had a sense of an impending mortal blow hovering just before him, less than seconds from descending, yet nothing happened, and no one was there. In spite of that, he felt nausea creeping into his stomach and throat, sickening his guts and making his steps feel heavy and plodding. Cold, bitter sweat began to pour from his brow and neck, stinging his eyes and tainting the flavor in his mouth. There were not many visible guards, just those he traveled with and a few patrols he had seen pass them or cross their path at a distance. Noting the walls and how they curved, he began to get a sense that this facility was not very large compared to the vastness of the ship, a dungeon or prison of some kind, from the looks of it.
And
Or
worse.
perhaps it was something far, far worse.
Worse.
Anakin could hardly hazard a guess, but what he did know was that the Force was worn and tortured in a way he had never sensed before. And he didn't want to even begin to guess what would have had to have happened here to cause this kind of effect. Every time he passed one of the spaced, heavily reinforced doors, he would feel a white-hot throb of pain spike into his skull.
Okay, so for Star Wars fans that are unaware of what this place is, this is an Inquisitor's personal playground where he gets to make heretics confess. And it's not nice, and it's not good, and this is like the opposite of Little House on the Prairie. Like the reflected polar opposite. Little Timmy is having a very bad day. This sucks.
With the crossing of each threshold nearly drawing out a hiss of protest from him each time, the Jedi was almost grateful for how short the remainder of their trip was. Soon, they brought him to the door he presumed to be his, a huge bulwark of black steel covered in purity seals and bearing a large, engraved number on its surface, number 9. To his profound dismay, this door also produced the same effect, and as they paused to wait, presumably for the arrival of the Enforcer, the Jedi quickly found himself desperate for a distraction. He tried to simply listen, but even the wheezing of the air cycling through the life support system sounded muted, as if the walls were made to absorb sound, which could very well be the case.
Probably is the case.
As they were arriving, he heard the barely audible, distant rumble of the turbolift starting up again. Even from this distance, it was shocking that such a huge, loud thing could be reduced to nary a whisper by walking down a few hallways. "We'll stop and wait. The Enforcer will be along," said the head of the three. "I was instructed to convey to you that if you want any hope of learning about the missing agent and his role with your master's competitor, you better do it now. The sister won't allow him to survive another Terran cycle. He's caused enough damage as it is, and if not for the abuses of your agency, he'd be dead already." She added, voice stiff and stern, the voice of a subordinate conveying a contentious message from one superior to another.
Yeah.
"Yes, fine. I'll do what I can." The false interrogator rasped dismissively under his breath. Anakin had been very curious, eager even, to meet with a potential traitor to the Imperium. There was an old saying, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend."
Not in this case.
While he was not so sure how true that statement would be in and of itself, he did figure that it sounded true enough to test out. Now, however, all he wanted to do was to crawl back into the lift they had entered from, and then to be away from this horrendous place. He was about to ask the woman he had been speaking with a question, any question, when she seemed to take notice of him first. "Are you okay?" she asked, looking over her shoulder at him. Of course. Oh, why?" Anakin started to lie, but the croak of his own voice was proof enough against his words. His hands and legs were shaking now. He hadn't even noticed. Was he poisoned? Sick?
Uh-oh.
He stuttered as the other two turned to face him more fully. "Dear throne, you aren't a psyker, are you?" the woman suddenly asked, her voice becoming shrill. Anakin's telepathic abilities were stricken by his state, and therefore sluggish, too sluggish to warn him of the woman's sudden suspicion and following epiphany. However, the Jedi Knight did indeed notice the change in her posture, the shifting of her weight, and the raising of the muzzle of her weapon.
That would be the first thing that I noticed.
The Force-born warrior was certainly distressed, pained in fact. But he was far from helpless, and even as the other two women began to move in sync with their leader, they could not quite overcome the simple fact that Anakin Skywalker himself was standing within Saber's reach of all of them. His blue blade activated, tearing out of the hidden pocket of his robes and flashing through the air and into his hand. The first sweep of the blade killed the woman to his left, slicing her cleanly in half, the follow-through taking the blue saber through the weapons of the other two, one of the shotguns exploding as his burning weapon touched the gunpowder in the shells. The resulting blast staggered all three warriors, though Anakin called on the Force, painful though it was, to push the remaining two Imperials into the wall opposite him, slamming each with enough force to knock them out. He slumped, leaning against the wall beside the door and wiping sweat out of his face. Already, he could hear the heavy, if smothered, footfalls of the...
Okay, I didn't anticipate this, but I should have. There is probably a blank somewhere nearby. And by probably, I mean almost certainly. And by almost certainly, I mean if it isn't a blank that's nearby, if it's not a psychic blank, it's going to be one of the Inquisition's little toys.
Nearby patrols rushing to investigate the sounds their struggles had caused. He'd have to fight his way out. His cover was blown, but he wasn't going to leave empty-handed. Looking at the door he had been brought to, he raised his saber and froze. The light that had been with him ever since he was born, the light of the Force itself, flickered and then failed.
Blank.
The Jedi Knight gasped loudly, dropping his saber from his hands, letting it deactivate and fall to the floor, letting it roll away. His fingers scrabbled and clutched at his chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't see. He...
Blank.
He took a deep breath again and held it, counting down 4, 3, 2, 1. He released it. He could see. He could breathe. But the Force was gone. He had no idea what was happening to him, but it had to be a result of this place, this prison. Reluctantly, he realized that he'd have no chance of escaping if he tried to take someone else along with him, and turned away from the door, looking for where his lightsaber had rolled, and froze for a second time. Standing there in the hallway was a
Sister of Silence.
thing. Anakin's eyes couldn't place it at first, couldn't quite comprehend it, despite its more or less mundane shape and baseline appearance. It was wearing powered armor, or at least something similar, and was holding a long two-handed sword. It was tall, but not as tall as a space marine. It was a woman, but not like the women he had seen before.
Yep.
It looked human, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. She was unhelmed, bald save for a single top knot of long white...
Okay, so Star Wars fans, do not be shocked, surprised, or anything if Anakin is killed in this exchange. This is one of those things that is like the librarian that is currently fighting this Legion of Jedi, but would get taken out by Mace Windu and anybody else that practices Vopod and knows what they're doing. Anakin has lost the Force because this person, going off of what he's doing here, which he's interlocking the Force and the Warp themselves, this person was known as a Sister of Silence. And a Sister of Silence, most of them are psychic blanks. And what a psychic blank is, essentially, they nullify the warp around them. There is no warp around them. They are considered to be soulless. In fact, if a blank or it's more commonly known, a pariah, if a pariah is born, most times the mother will kill it because it welcome to 40K. Here we go. If Anakin lives, I'm gonna be surprised because this thing is designed to kill. Well, it's not designed. It's born with the ability to completely negate psychic abilities around them. In fact, of all the people that have ever lived, the only ones who could possibly see the Emperor for how he actually is, the Emperor of Mankind for how he actually is one of the blanks. Because his glamours that he uses naturally to enhance himself, to enhance his charisma, things like that, it does not work on these people.
White hair, braided into a thick rope which reached down to the back of her shins. Her face was smooth, almost as pale as her hair, and adorned with blue eyes that never seemed to blink and pierced the soul. Even through the thick plates of her fitted armor, one could see that she was molded into the lithe form of a dancer, despite how casually she handled the brutal blade in her hands. She was, without a doubt, the single most hideous thing that Anakin Skywalker had ever seen in the entirety of his life.
This is not an uncommon reaction.
It, or whatever this person, this enforcer was not human, nor anything even remotely close. The death in her eyes was the death of everything, the death of the Force itself.
Okay. Again, I gotta interrupt for Star Wars fans who do not understand what this is and what is happening. Psychic blanks, the normal reaction to being around a psychic blank is aggression. Y'all be quiet. Daddy's talking about stuff on here. Stop barking. They don't listen. Anyhow, the normal reaction to anybody encountering a psychic blank is aggression. It's almost a primal need to defend oneself. Psychers experience loads of pain from being around them. What Anakin has experienced, it wouldn't matter if, if this particular Sister of Silence was a swimsuit model or literally one of the most beautiful women in the world, could be a contestant for Miss Universe. Anakin would still see her as a legitimate primal threat to his existence just based off the fact that she is what she is.
And as she came closer, step by step, the world bleached more and more. Anakin pulled his eyes from her with great effort, starting to search for his lightsaber once again. In near immediate response, the Force-eating creature swept its sword up, striking the bar of fluorescent light above them and shattering it. Light flashed blindingly bright for the briefest of instants, and then the Jedi found his segment of the hall bathed in blackness. Frigid fear worked its way through Anakin as he tried to look around, but found his flesh and blood eyes a poor substitute for his Force intuitions. He tried to reach out to call his saber to himself, but he couldn't even see the weapon nor feel the Force. Realizing his task was fruitless, Anakin crouched in the darkness, fumbling about with his hands, and feeling the cooling body of the warrior he'd bisected earlier. Meanwhile, the thing in the hallway had begun to walk forward, footsteps sounding softly in the shadows. The Jedi could feel his heart beating in his ears, fingers probing about desperately until he found the stock and handle of the woman's shotgun. He could still hear it getting closer, yet somehow the thing in the hallway was simultaneously becoming harder to hear, something Anakin chalked up to his panic. He gave the gun a few hard tugs, wrenching it out of the warrior's dead grip with a frustrated yell and nearly falling back with the effort. Weapon in hand, Anakin rose, his shoulder against the wall, shotgun out and leveled as he slid up to a standing position. He could not hear her any longer. The only sound the Jedi could make out being those of his own shuddering breaths and the rapid pounding of his own beating heart. He was sweating still, but now he felt so cold, so severed from the Force that his bones were aching. Saliva gathered in his mouth rapidly. His body, his very cells, seeming to forget how to function without the constant company of the Force. Despite this, he kept control of his breathing and kept his mind and thoughts under control enough to know what he was doing. Anakin waited. He listened, and after a few brief moments of silence, he took a step back. He stepped right into the silent monster, and had half suspected that he would. Spraying bitter sweat with emotion, he rolled forward, avoiding the wide flat of the thing's blade. But his hood and robe did not. Caught on the superhuman strength of servo actuators, the Jedi was thrown aside, thick robe torn away by the action, and left tangled on the large sword of this new, monstrous Imperial. To his credit, the Jedi kept his feet, staggering for only a moment before he lifted and fired the shotgun. The blast was inaccurate, and the kickback nearly took the gun right out of Anakin's hands, leaving him briefly fumbling with the weapon. Meanwhile, the blast and following glints of shrapnel striking armor lit the space for just long enough for the enemy's approaching form to be visible. The Jedi Knight kicked, catching the new warrior in the chest, but failing to stop her advance or stagger her back. Instead, she rushed in through the blow, Anakin yowling in pain as he stomped into her unyielding form, and was instead himself carried back and pinned to the wall. He kept his leg braced against her, trying to push back as he brought the gun up again for
I'm honestly hoping that Anakin doesn't die right now. I mean, just saying. Like, I know, I've said it 1,000 times. Well, not 1,000 times, but you guys know. Morally, I want Star Wars to win. But then you have things like this. I am, unless something happens, I'm almost convinced that Anakin's going to die in the next few minutes.
Another shot. He blasted, but not before she had come even closer, forcing his knee to bend and grabbing the muzzle of his gun, yanking it out to the right just before he fired. The shotgun discharged out to the side, showing Anakin another flash of his assailant's face, dead eyes burrowing into his. But soon he did not need the light of his gunfire to see those pale blue spheres of hers. Still pinned to the wall by the pressure on his curled leg, Anakin watched as the sword the woman wielded came to life, sparking along the blade and illuminating its surface with the incandescence of a deadly power field. She held it, single-handed, up nearly against his throat. His free hand had grabbed her wrist, his right hand still clutching the shotgun, she herself having an arm that was similarly occupied. She tore the gun out of his hand, and he raised his palm. "I am one with the Force," Anakin muttered, focusing hard, attempting to pierce the penumbra of fear which had ensnared him, trying with all his might to touch the Force, to use it, to wield it. He watched the woman's deathly eyes widen somewhat, watched her top knot sway in a wind that did not exist, and then watched her respond by using her recently freed hand to grab his neck. He choked, faltering as her ceramite fingers closed around his airway, his own hand instinctively grabbing at her wrist, trying to pry her off. But she was implacable, answering his resistance by slamming his head back against the wall, once, twice, and then a third time. Anakin's vision was spinning. He could feel foam and spittle gathering at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't just that she was strangling him, but now that she was touching him directly, he felt as if his mind were an oyster caught in a crushing pincer, mere moments from splitting open. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He needed help. But this time, as darkness closed in around him, Anakin found no clones charging to the rescue or sudden shouted war cry of help being on the way.
Wow.
All he found, all he saw, as his mind faded away into unconsciousness were those empty, monstrous blue eyes staring, unblinking, unfaltering into his own. Like twin voids expanding in a cruel sky, they devoured him, and Anakin Skywalker knew no more.
Oh my god. Meanwhile... Okay, seriously, I am not sure, like, I hope he's not dead. I hope she doesn't kill him. I don't see a reason why she would keep him alive other than to interrogate him.
R2 watched on from the shadows, telescoping eye peeking out from around the corner as they dragged his friend's limp, unconscious body into the room, the door shutting behind the Imperial guards a moment later. Outside the now closing door, the silent woman who had beaten Anakin signed something with her hands to another pair of guards. It had been somewhat difficult to track his Jedi companion down to this place, and he had been forced to rely more than once on the Imperials merely overlooking him, something he hated to do. After all, R2 hated to be overlooked, but even he had to admit that it was oftentimes a pretty useful skill, here more than anywhere else. He had actually ridden down on the same lift as this strange, silent woman, having arrived before her and waited in the corner of the massive cavity. The droid had taken particular care to avoid anyone dressed in red, but even then, it had been far from certain no one else would question his presence, unobtrusive as it was. Yet it truly did seem that, for most he passed, anything as complex as he was beyond their realm of authorized thought, and they mostly attempted to ignore him as he went by. They had even gone so far as to bow and move out of his way once or twice, murmuring prayers to a machine god in their odd, guttural language. This seemed to apply to even the formidable silent woman, as she had not questioned his admittedly distant presence even once. Now he waited, he watched. While R2 had the translation matrix for their spoken language, he had never seen their sign language before, and R2, competent though he was, never claimed to be anything like a protocol droid. As beneficial as he took that to be most days, it did also mean that he had no way of synthesizing a translation for himself. And, as much as he wished he could understand the three, he also knew he needed to act fast. Anakin was in danger, now bound and locked inside of room number 9. The droid tried to use his internal communicator to contact the Bad Batch, Tech in particular. R2 had little doubt that the brainy clone could begin deciphering the hand signs, and, in either event, he was also the only one liable to understand R2's message quickly. Yet, when the droid tried to contact them, he got nothing back but static. His processors initiated cooling cycles as he considered what might have happened to the clone commandos, but dismissed the logic, thinking instead that it was more likely that this place, this small, strange prison, was somehow jamming his communication attempts. That left him with two options. He could leave and try to track down the Bad Batch by one means or another and bring them to Anakin's rescue, or he could save them all a lot of time and effort and simply do it himself. Locating Anakin's lost lightsaber nearby, R2 resolved to handle the situation personally.
There you go.
Reaching out a clamp and, silently as he could, retrieving the weapon and storing it within his chassis. As if in reaction, the three women turned and began moving in his direction, coming at a jog. R2 straightened himself back around the corner, photoreceptors spinning as he panicked for a brief moment. Where to go? Where to hide? He heard footsteps just beyond the bend and straightened, going rigid and shutting off his light indicators. Milliseconds later, the silent woman turned the bend, rushing past him and towards the lift. The other two came shortly after, though one of them paused, slowing and coming to a stop in front of R2. The woman, who had some blood smudged against her lips, centered her visored eyes on the droid. R2 had to shut down his synthetic response units to prevent himself from trembling, feeling her scrutiny intensify as she stepped closer and then kicked the hatch to his chassis lightly with her foot.
Theodora, what are you doing? We have to go find the Inquisitor, now!
Said the other woman from down the hall.
I know. I just need to throw something away. It's dragging me down. How in the bloody hell did you open this trash bin?
Was her response, scowling as she kicked R2 again, nearly knocking loose one of the hastily applied skulls of his disguise. The savvy droid took the opportunity to swing his body up and parallel, popping open his chassis once more. He desperately hoped she did not notice the tools, mechanical arms, and, of course, Anakin's lightsaber, all stuffed within the now visible confines. He needn't have worried. The woman hastily stuffed the broken remnants of her shotgun into the cavity, cramming them in painfully before manually kicking closed his chassis hatch and running off to catch up to the others.
Poor
R2 waited until he could hear the lift start up again, and then released a low, relieved whistle. Then, with a shake of his rotating dome, he steeled himself and looked down the now empty hallway. After a few minutes, the guards that had been inside exited, walking away in the opposite direction, giving him his chance. Thinking of his imprisoned friend and his beloved owner back on Coruscant, the little droid trundled forward and approached the mechanical controls of the massive black door. He had faith that he'd be able to adapt to one of its ports, but felt more than a little trepidation as he came closer. After all, from what he understood, this room had already housed one inhabitant. And as R2 reached up and began to manipulate the door's controls, he truly could not help but wonder, what kind of creature was considered a criminal by an empire that would make the cruelest hut green with envy? The thought was troubling, but he held on to it. After all, the logic behind that caution was more than sound, and only made him worry all the more for the fate of his Jedi friend.
Meanwhile...
To my most esteemed and illustrious War Master, Lord Tyrannus Macarion II. I am most pleased to report the success of my inquiries, my lord, and am further pleased to confirm your suspicions. While many among the sector regimental forces seem to be more than susceptible to subversion and indoctrination, the Calambian Patriots, widely regarded as one of the premier fighting forces of the sector itself, are anything but desirable in these regards. Your decision, therefore, to group them with the other non-compliant regiments that came from outside the sector was a prudent one. Soon, the losses suffered by those forces shall either ensure their irrelevance or, most ideally, fate them to extinction.
Nice.
Additionally, their martyrdom will further increase the fires that you shall use to soften the loyalty of both the fighting men and officer castes, preparing them for the hammering that is to follow. Still, I do appreciate that only 70% of the Calambian fighting forces within our own command could be transported down to New Cadia, and that the rest will have to be dealt with in their own time, and without undue attention or actions that might draw suspicion. To help appraise you on future actions, my lord, I have taken the liberty of compiling several excerpts from the record known as the Triumph of Pride, which details the induction of Calambia into the Imperium during the Great Crusade.
I'm not sure if he's traitor or loyal. Not yet. I'm trying to gather up what he's saying here.
While it is to be expected that a great many things have changed within their culture in the intervening millennia, I have found this record vital in understanding the Calambians, both in how to utilize them and in how to unmake them. It also goes a long way to explaining precisely why the Calambians are unlikely to break away and join our cause fully. Please view it and judge its merits at your leisure. With abundant regards, Pius Gorthank, Adjunct to the War Master.
Huh. Okay, so I'm glad that Anakin isn't dead. It's one of those things where I didn't expect it, but when it happened, I knew what was going to happen. I knew what was going to go on. As much as powerful as Anakin is, everything has its counter, and the counter to a Jedi, 100%, besides of course a librarian, is one of them, because she simply takes away their power entirely. There is a group in a called the Calexis Assassins within the Imperium that specifically and only brings in psychers and brings in blanks, and those blanks will learn how to suppress the field that's around them, so they can kind of sort of blend in for long enough to get around their targets. And their targets are almost always psychers. This doesn't surprise me. This was another great episode. I'm glad that Anakin isn't dead. I got a feeling the next time we catch up with the librarian and his little fight with the Jedi, he's going to wind up being the second that Mace winds up getting there. It's going to take Mace a little bit to turn everything back against him, but it's going to happen. It's just one of those things that is absolutely 100% going to happen. But I don't know what kind of effect it's going to have on the rest of the Jedi. In any case, love it. Love it. It's good to be back. I'll catch you guys next time. Hit button.